At 38, I learned what abandonment feels like when it's wrapped in the word family. The farmhouse my grandmother left me wasn't just wood and windows. It was the only place I'd ever truly belonged. When my parents decided to sell it behind my back to fund my sister's new life, they didn't just cross a line, they erased it. I'm Evelyn Hart, and this is how I sold my own inheritance before they could, burned every bridge they thought I'd never leave, and found something stronger on the other side. If you've ever felt expendable to the people you love, listen closely. The scent of ripe apples clung to the crisp autumn air, drifting in from the small orchard just beyond the wraparound porch. Beneath my boots, the farmhouse's original oak floors groaned in that familiar, comforting way, like an old friend shifting to greet me. Light streamed in from the north-facing windows of the converted art studio, pooling softly on the scarred wooden work table where my grandmother, Nora Whitaker, used to paint for hours without noticing the time. It was late afternoon, and the house seemed to breathe around me, its every creak and whisper a reminder that this place was alive with memory. I had been coming here since I was 8 years old. Summers were spent with dirt under my fingernails and freckles on my nose. My days filled with tending to vegetable rows, baking pies from apples we'd picked that morning, and listening to Grandma Nora tell stories in the rocking chair on the porch. She had a way of looking me in the eye when she spoke, as though every word mattered, even if it was just about watering the tomatoes. Never let your kindness be something others can price, she told me once, her weathered hands folding around mine. Not even family, especially family. Back then, I'd nodded without truly understanding. The understanding came years later after she was gone. Her passing had been expected. She was 89, still sharp, still smiling, but her heart simply grew tired. At the reading of her will, I had braced myself for the usual polite thank yous and formalities. Instead, my name was spoken alongside a specific bequest, the farmhouse and its surrounding 2 acres. Only me. The lawyer slid a thick envelope across the table, her eyes flicking toward my parents for just a fraction of a second before returning to her notes. Inside, I found the property deed and a letter written in my grandmother's looping cursive. My dearest Evelyn, this house is yours because you love it as I have. You've listened to its walls, added your laughter to its rooms, and understood what it means to care for something not because it's profitable, but because it matters. This is not just a place. It is part of who you are. Protect it. Live in it. Let it shelter you. And when you read these words, remember, someone will try to take it from you. Be ready. I'd smiled at that last line, half amused, half confused. Who would try to take the house from me? My parents already had a comfortable home. My sister Sienna was allergic to the countryside, preferring city cafes and gallery openings to fields and fresh air. At 29, she was the adored younger daughter, a self-described free spirit whose unfinished art degree was matched by an equally unfinished resume. My parents, Marjorie and Paul Hart, treated Sienna's unpredictability as a charming quirk, the mark of a true artist. They bailed her out of bad leases, paid off credit card bills, and praised her sensitivity as if it were a rare gemstone. Meanwhile, my own reliability was as invisible to them as the beams in their living room ceiling, holding everything up, but never noticed unless something went wrong. I was the one they called to watch the dog when they travelled. The one who planned holiday meals when they were too busy. The one who lent Sienna money without ever being paid back. It wasn't resentment I felt back then, just a quiet awareness that I was the family's anchor, and anchors weren't meant to drift. Still, the imbalance was obvious. If Sienna forgot someone's birthday, it was because she was in a creative headspace. If I did, it was uncharacteristic and met with subtle disappointment. Standing in the studio now, running my hand over the windowsill, worn smooth by decades of sunlight, I thought again about that line in my grandmother's letter. Someone will try to take it from you. The words had felt abstract before, the sort of thing a protective grandmother might say about opportunistic strangers. But looking back, there had been moments, tiny, easily dismissed, when I'd caught a certain calculating look in my mother's eyes when she visited, or a curious question from my father about how much upkeep a place like this costs. I brushed those thoughts away then, the way you dismiss a sudden chill on a sunny day. After all, they were my parents. Family didn't take what wasn't theirs, or so I believed. What I didn't know then was that my grandmother's warning was not just a whimsical afterthought, it was a prophecy. And before long it would come true in ways that would test not only my right to the farmhouse, but my place in the family I thought I knew. Sunday dinners at my parents' house had a script, and everyone knew their lines. I'd bring dessert, my father would carve the roast, my mother would fuss over the table settings, and Sienna would breeze in late with some dramatic story from her week. That night, though, she didn't just have a story, she had an announcement. "I'm pregnant," she said, one manicured hand resting lightly on her still flat stomach. The room stilled for a heartbeat before my mother's chair scraped back so she could wrap her arms around her youngest daughter. My father's grin spread wide, his eyes dampening with a joy I had never seen directed at me. Within seconds they were talking about baby names, godparents, and, inevitably, housing. "You can't raise a baby in that tiny apartment," my mother said, squeezing Sienna's hand. "We'll figure something out." The conversation moved on without me. Plates passed, wine poured. I excused myself to the kitchen under the pretense of checking on the coffee. That's when I heard it, my father's voice, low but clear. "If we list the farmhouse in the spring, we can get top dollar. It's the perfect market for it right now." My mother's reply was immediate, as if they'd rehearsed. "Evelyn will understand. She's reasonable." I froze, fingers tightening around the coffee pot handle. They weren't talking about helping Sienna rent a bigger place. They were talking about selling my house, the house my grandmother had left to me, the one I'd been maintaining for years with my own money. I stepped back into the dining room, my pulse in my ears. "My house?" I said evenly, sliding into my chair. My father didn't flinch. "Technically, yes, but you have to admit, it's more of a family asset. You're hardly there during the week." "It's not a family asset," I said, my voice sharp enough to make Sienna look up from her phone. "It's mine. Grandma left it to me in her will. I pay the taxes, the insurance, the upkeep. And we appreciate that," my mother cut in, using the syrupy tone she reserved for coaxing people toward decisions they didn't want to make. "But you have to think practically. Your sister needs a proper home for the baby," I stared at them, "so buy her one." "We don't have that kind of money just sitting around," my father snapped, the edge in his voice betraying his impatience. "This is about family helping family." Sienna leaned back, an almost smug smile on her lips. "We already measured the upstairs room facing east for the nursery. It gets such perfect morning light." The casual certainty in her tone was a slap. They had already planned it, measured it, imagined it, claimed it, without so much as a conversation with me. The room she was talking about was where I kept my grandmother's quilts, my easel, the pieces of my life I didn't want to leave in the city. The rest of dinner passed in a blur. I answered questions mechanically, my appetite gone, my mind replaying their words on a loop. By dessert, I knew I couldn't sit there another second. I pushed back my chair, murmured something about an early meeting, and stood. My mother's eyes narrowed slightly. "We're not finished discussing this." "I am," I said, surprising even myself with the steel in my voice. I grabbed my coat and purse, walked to the door, and, for the first time in my life, let it slam behind me. The sound echoed down the quiet suburban street, like a gunshot announcing the first real fracture in a family that had always preferred to pretend everything was fine. A week after that disastrous Sunday dinner, my phone buzzed with a group text from my parents. "Open house next Saturday at 1 p.m. Make sure the place is tidy." I stared at the screen, rereading the words. They hadn't asked. They hadn't even hinted. They'd just decided. My hands tightened around the phone until my knuckles whitened. The gall of it, acting like the farmhouse was theirs to schedule viewings for, would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. I didn't reply. Instead, I scrolled to Tessa's contact and hit call. She answered on the second ring. "I was wondering how long it would take before you called," she said, her tone a mix of sympathy and anticipation. "They've scheduled an open house," I said flatly. "Didn't ask me, didn't even tell me in advance." I could hear Tessa exhale sharply. "That's not just overstepping, Evelyn. That's trespassing, if they actually go through with it." "I know," I said, pacing the length of my apartment. I could call a lawyer, change the locks, but they'd just find another way to push. They think I'll give in eventually. "Do you remember what your grandmother made you promise?" Tessa's voice softened, but there was steel under it. I closed my eyes, and the memory came back in an instant. Me, at 17, sitting on the porch steps as Grandma Nora rocked beside me. Her hands had been cool and steady when she took mine. "Promise me you'll protect this place from anyone who would take it for the wrong reasons," she'd said. "Even if that person shares your blood." I opened my eyes. My grandmother's letter, with its final warning, wasn't just a sentimental flourish. It was a directive. "They're not going to take it from me," I said slowly. "I'll sell it before I let them have it, and I'll do it on my terms." There was a pause, and then Tessa laughed, a short, sharp sound. Now that's the Evelyn I know. The decision settled over me like a second skin, familiar, protective. I wouldn't let them dictate the terms. I wouldn't even give them the satisfaction of knowing what I was doing until it was too late. I called Lydia Cho, a broker I'd worked with for years. "I want to list my own property," I told her. "Fast, quiet, private showings only. And I'll write the copy myself." Lydia didn't ask why. She knew me well enough to sense this wasn't small talk territory. "Send me the details tonight. I'll get my photographer over there in 2 days. You want staging?" "Yes," I said. "Full staging. I want it to look like it belongs in a magazine." Over the next 48 hours, I threw myself into preparation. I spent Friday at the farmhouse polishing every surface, arranging fresh flowers in the kitchen, and clearing out anything personal. The smell of lemon oil and clean wood filled the air. Outside, I trimmed the hedges and raked the leaves until my shoulders ached. When the photographer arrived Saturday morning, the house was ready. Sunlight poured through the windows, catching the gleam of the restored floors and the honeyed tones of the oak beams. The orchard looked like something from a postcard, the apples blushing red against the green leaves. I wrote the listing myself that night. Historic farmhouse with modern amenities on 2 landscaped acres, complete with established apple orchard, original hardwood floors, and handcrafted details. Updated kitchen and bathrooms, new roof, and fully rewired, 90 minutes from downtown. The perfect weekend retreat or full-time residence for those seeking peace without sacrificing comfort. Private, selective. Mine. The first showing day dawned crisp and bright, the kind of early autumn morning that made the farmhouse look like a postcard. I'd scheduled 6 appointments, each spaced an hour apart, to give me time to reset the house between visits. The first couple was polite but detached, asking about square footage and heating costs, without once stepping onto the porch or glancing at the orchard. The second was a family from the city whose kids immediately began running through the halls. Their parents murmured about tearing out these old floors and opening up the kitchen. I forced a smile, already feeling the tension creep into my shoulders. By the time the third visitor arrived, an investor with a clipboard and 2 bright eyes, I was bracing myself. He walked through each room making notes, barely reacting until we reached the studio. Perfect for converting into a short-term rental unit, he said, his tone brisk, transactional. The words hit me like a slap. I pictured strangers tramping through the orchard, loud music spilling into the quiet night, the careful peace of the place shattered for profit. I nodded mechanically, but inside I felt something tighten. Selling was one thing, watching someone strip away the soul of the farmhouse was another. The 4th and 5th appointments brought more of the same, speculators and dreamers with visions that didn't match my own. It was beginning to feel like the day would end without finding the right buyer. Then, just as the afternoon light began to tilt golden, Marcus Hale arrived. He was in his mid-40s, tall, with the kind of presence that made the air feel steadier somehow. As we shook hands, his gaze moved over the porch, the orchard, the windows, lingering as though he was memorizing the way the light fell. Inside, he moved slowly, his touch skimming the banister as if he could feel the history in the grain of the oak. In the studio, he paused for a long time, looking up at the high, north-facing windows. My late wife was a painter, he said finally. She always dreamed of a space with light like this. She would have loved this room. Something in his voice, the quiet reverence, the absence of salesmanship made my chest ache. This wasn't a man seeing dollar signs. This was someone recognizing value the way my grandmother had taught me to. When we finished the tour, Marcus asked if we could sit on the porch for a moment. We settled into the rocking chairs, the orchard spread out before us. The air was cool, tinged with the faint scent of apples. If I made an offer, he said, would you want to come back and visit? This place clearly means something to you. I blinked, caught off guard. No one had ever asked me that before, not in any sale I'd handled as an agent, and certainly not today. Most people don't invite the previous owner to drop in, I said carefully. I'm not most people, he replied simply. It was such an unexpected kindness that I had to look away for a moment. The idea that the farmhouse could be cared for, not just owned, shifted something in me. 2 hours later, his agent called mine with a clean offer, full asking price, no contingencies, and a flexible closing date to give me time to say goodbye. I accepted without hesitation. For the first time since this began, I felt like I was choosing the future of the house, not having it taken from me. The week before closing, I drove out to the farmhouse with boxes, determined to take only what truly mattered. There were things that could be replaced, furniture, cookware, even some art, but others were irreplaceable. The first to go into the box was my grandmother's recipe book. Its pages soft and curling at the edges from decades of use. The cover was worn and the spine had been reinforced with tape more than once, but inside the handwriting was hers, looping, confident, with little notes in the margins like "needs more cinnamon" or "Evelyn's favourite, don't forget the lemon zest." Next was the quilt she had made for me the summer I turned 16. I could still see her sitting on the porch with it spread across her lap, stitching the last pieces together in the fading light. The colours were soft but bright, faded blues, warm creams, and the occasional pop of red. She'd told me it was meant to be a map of every summer you've spent here. I walked through each room, pausing to take photographs. Not for listing purposes this time, but for me. The kitchen bathed in morning light, the fireplace with its stone hearth, the view from the upstairs east-facing window that Sienna had so casually claimed for her nursery. There was a strange quiet to the house that day. It felt like it was holding its breath, aware that its keeper was about to change. I moved slowly, touching the banister, running my fingers over the carved wood of the bedroom door frames. By the time closing day arrived, I'd made my peace, or at least something close to it. Marcus met me at the title company's office, his handshake warm and steady. The paperwork was routine, the legal language dry, but underneath it all, I felt the weight of what I was signing away. When we'd finished, Marcus reached into his briefcase and pulled out a simple cream-coloured business card. "My personal number," he said, sliding it across the table. "If you ever want to visit, the door's open, always." It was an unexpectedly generous gesture, and I found myself smiling even as my chest tightened. "Thank you, that means more than you know." We stepped outside, and the autumn sun was bright but cool. As I walked to my car, the cashier's check in my bag felt both heavy and hollow. I had done what needed to be done. The farmhouse was in good hands, and yet a part of me still ached with the knowledge that I wouldn't be the one tending its orchard or hearing its floors creak at night. That evening, back in my apartment, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window, letting the city noise fill the space where the quiet of the country used to be. My phone buzzed with a new message. It was from my mother. I opened it to find a photo. A neatly drawn floor plan of an upstairs room, annotated with notes like "crib here" and "changing table under window." The caption read, "Nursery plan. Can't wait to get started." For a moment, I just stared at it, my mind scrambling to process what I was seeing. She was talking about the east-facing upstairs room, the one that no longer belonged to me, the one that now belonged to Marcus. I typed and erased several responses before finally setting the phone down. It wasn't even anger this time, it was disbelief. Had she forgotten the house was sold? Or worse, did she simply not believe it? Either way, I knew the storm wasn't over. The papers might be signed, the keys handed over, but the fight for my boundaries had only just begun. It was barely past 8 on Saturday morning when my phone began buzzing insistently. The name on the screen made my stomach clench. Dad. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but the sheer persistence of the ringing made that impossible. When I finally answered, his voice was tight with urgency. "Evelyn, thank God. There's someone in your house." I sat up straight. "What are you talking about?" We drove out with Sienna to take some measurements for the nursery, he said quickly. And when we went inside, there was a man there. He said we were trespassing. He's calling the police. It took a moment for the pieces to click into place. You went into the farmhouse? I asked slowly. Of course. I still have the spare key from when we helped you move the furniture last year, he said, as if this were perfectly reasonable. I swung my legs out of bed, already reaching for my jeans. Stay there, I said. I'll be there in an hour. The drive out was a blur of speeding asphalt and pounding heartbeat. When I pulled into the gravel driveway, the scene in front of me looked like something from a bad TV drama. A police cruiser was parked behind my parents' SUV. My mother sat on the porch steps, pale and trembling. My father was gesturing animatedly at a uniformed officer. Sienna was in the passenger seat of the SUV, her face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking with theatrical sobs. And leaning casually against the railing, arms folded, was Marcus Hale. All eyes turned to me as I got out of the car. My father strode toward me, relief flashing in his expression. Tell this officer it's all a misunderstanding. This is your house and we have permission to be here. I looked from him to Marcus, who met my gaze calmly. Actually, I said, projecting my voice just enough for everyone to hear, this isn't my house anymore. I sold it 2 weeks ago. Marcus is the legal owner now. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Sienna's sobs stuttered to a halt. My father's face shifted from confusion to dawning horror. My mother stared as if I'd spoken in another language. You... What? She finally managed. I sold it, I repeated, keeping my tone even. Legally. The sale is recorded with the county. You have no right to be here. The officer turned to my parents. Ma'am, sir, are you saying you entered this property without the owner's permission? It's a family matter, my father insisted, his voice rising. We were going to sell it for my daughter. Your plans, I cut in, not mine. You decided what to do with my property without asking me. You kept a key you never returned. And today, you broke into a house that doesn't belong to me or to you. My mother shook her head, still in disbelief. You can't have sold it without telling us. We had plans. Again, I said, your plans, not mine. Sienna burst from the SUV then, charging toward me with red-rimmed eyes. You ruined everything. You've always been jealous of me, and now you're taking it out on my baby. I met her glare steadily. You needed a place to live. That doesn't mean you were entitled to mine. Marcus's voice cut through the tension, calm but firm. Officer, I'm not pressing charges as long as they leave now and understand they can't return without my invitation. The officer nodded. That's your choice, sir. But I recommend changing the locks if you haven't already. Already done, Marcus said, glancing at me with a faint smile. My father opened his mouth to argue, but my mother caught his arm. Not here, she said sharply. Let's go. She tugged Sienna back toward the SUV, but not before my sister threw one last glare at me, her voice shaking with rage. You've destroyed this family, she spat. No, I said quietly. I just stopped letting you destroy me. They drove away without another word. The officer offered Marcus a polite nod before following them down the road. For a long moment, Marcus and I stood there on the porch, the orchard behind us, and the echo of my family's anger still hanging in the air. Finally, he said, You handled that well. I let out a shaky breath. That was me handling it? He smiled faintly. You drew a line. That's more than most people can do. The email from my father arrived 3 days after the porch confrontation. It was written in the kind of formal tone that tried and failed to disguise fury. Evelyn, in light of recent events, it is only fair that you turn over the proceeds from the sale of the farmhouse. As you know, the property was always considered a family asset, intended to provide for your sister and her child. We expect you to do the right thing. Let us know how you wish to transfer the funds. It was signed simply, Dad. No love, no yours. Just a demand dressed up in politeness. The next day, my phone lit up with a voicemail from my mother. Her voice was tremulous, wet with tears. I can't believe you would go behind our backs like this. Your grandmother would be so disappointed. You've broken this family, Evelyn. Do you know what your sister is going through right now? She's in pieces, and it's all because you're holding on to money you don't even need. As if it were that simple. By the end of the week, the whispers had spread through the extended family. My Aunt Carol sent a clipped text. I heard you sold the family home and kept the money. Is that true? My cousin Michelle posted something vague, but pointed on Facebook about selfish people who forget where they came from. Even my Uncle Ron, who I barely spoke to, left me a rambling voicemail about honouring the family legacy. It was exhausting trying to decide who had heard the truth, who had heard a twisted version, and who had simply decided to believe the loudest voices. The real gut punch came on Tuesday during a meeting with a long-time real estate client. We were sitting across from each other at the conference table, going over listing comps, when she leaned back in her chair and asked, almost casually, "So, I heard you sold a family property recently for yourself." The way she phrased it, "for yourself," made my cheeks flush hot. It wasn't curiosity, it was judgment. I kept my voice level. I sold a property I inherited from my grandmother, yes. She smiled tightly, clearly taking that as confirmation of whatever rumour she'd heard. Well, I suppose everyone's entitled to make their own decisions. The meeting went on, but the air had shifted. For the first time in years, I felt my professional credibility under quiet scrutiny. It wasn't just a family matter anymore, it was bleeding into my career, the one place I'd always been sure-footed. That night I sat in my apartment with a glass of water, staring at the city lights beyond my balcony. It wasn't the house itself that was gnawing at me, it was the realization of how conditional my worth had always been to my family. I was valuable when I was fixing things, lending money, smoothing over problems. I was reliable when I sacrificed my own plans for theirs. But the moment I said no, I became selfish, disloyal, disposable. It was like seeing a map of my family dynamic with all the false roads erased, leaving only the hard, unpaved truth. I thought back to my grandmother's letter, to the warning she'd tucked between her words of love. Someone will try to take it from you. She'd known, even then, that the threat wasn't a stranger or a distant cousin. It was the people sitting across from me at Sunday dinners. And now they were proving her right in ways that felt almost scripted. In the weeks after the confrontation, I decided that if my family was going to paint me as selfish, I might as well live in a way that proved I could stand on my own without apology. The first step was practical. I met with a financial advisor to map out a plan for the proceeds from the sale. We structured investments, stocks, bonds, a modest retirement annuity, so that the money would work for me instead of sitting idly. It wasn't about greed, it was about security. For once, I was thinking long-term for myself, not for anyone else. I also found a condo closer to my office, a small 2-bedroom unit on the 10th floor of a mid-rise with a wide balcony. It wasn't the farmhouse, but the balcony overlooked a park. And I could already picture terracotta pots lined up with herbs, tomatoes, and maybe even dwarf apple trees if I could find them. It was a slice of peace in the middle of the city's constant hum. The first night there, I sat on that balcony with a mug of tea, looking out at the lights blinking in the distance. It wasn't the same as hearing the wind move through orchard leaves, but it was mine, entirely mine. Every few weeks, Marcus would send me a photo from the farmhouse. In the fall, the orchard was aflame with red and gold. In winter, the porch was draped in snow. In spring, the garden beds were tilled and ready. Each image carried a double edge, comfort that the place was loved, and a sharp pang that it wasn't my hands tending it anymore. One rainy Sunday afternoon, I was unpacking the last of my boxes when I came across my grandmother's recipe book. I sat at the kitchen table and opened it, flipping through pages stained with time. Near the back, a folded slip of paper caught my eye, one I didn't remember seeing before. It was another note from her, written in the same looping hand. Evelyn, if you're reading this, it means the house has been tested. People will try to take what they didn't build, to spend what they didn't earn. Stand your ground. Remember that love without respect is not love at all. And if you must let go, do it on your terms, not theirs. I sat back, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. She hadn't just warned me once. She'd planted reminders in different places, knowing I might need them at different times. It was the affirmation I didn't know I'd been waiting for. That night, I drafted a letter with my attorney's help. It was short, polite, and unyielding. It stated, in plain legal language, that any further attempts by my parents to claim the proceeds from the sale of the farmhouse would be considered harassment and would be met with legal action. We attached copies of the deed, the sale contract, and the county recording. I sent it by certified mail to both of them, knowing full well it would land like a thunderclap. There was no immediate reply, no angry phone call, no guilt-laden voicemail, just silence, dense, deliberate silence. And in that quiet, I felt something I hadn't in months, space. Space to breathe without defending myself, space to think about what I wanted next instead of constantly reacting to what they demanded. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was the beginning of a boundary they couldn't pretend wasn't there. The message came out of nowhere on a Wednesday afternoon. I was in the middle of reviewing a property inspection report when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. "Hey, it's Noah. Can we meet? Just you and me. There are things you should know." I stared at the text for a moment, debating. Noah Brooks, Sienna's boyfriend, soon-to-be father of her child, had always been polite when we crossed paths, but never more than that. I couldn't imagine what he wanted to tell me, or why he would risk Sienna's wrath to do it. We agreed to meet at a quiet coffee shop halfway between my office and his work. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 mugs of coffee. He looked tired, really tired, in a way that went beyond lack of sleep. "Thanks for coming," he said, offering a faint smile. "I'll be honest," I replied, sliding into the seat across from him. "I'm curious why you wanted to talk to me. I'm not exactly on the family's favourite person list right now." "That's part of it," he admitted. He stirred his coffee, eyes on the swirling liquid. "I think you deserve to know the truth about what's been going on, and I'm not sure anyone else is going to tell you." I stayed quiet, letting him find his pace. First off, he began, we're not broke. I've got a good job in IT, steady salary, benefits. We can afford our apartment just fine. It's small, yeah, but it's in a good neighbourhood with solid schools. We were already talking about saving for something bigger down the line. My brows lifted slightly. So the whole Sienna and the baby can't possibly live there line? He gave a humourless laugh. That was your parents, and Sienna went along with it because it sounded like a faster way to get more space without us having to wait. I leaned back, feeling the pieces shift in my mind. I never wanted the farmhouse, Noah continued. Honestly, it's not practical for us. My commute would be a nightmare, and Sienna's not exactly the rural type. But once your parents floated the idea, she grabbed onto it. They made it sound like it was already a done deal, that you'd see reason eventually. Every time I questioned it, she said her parents knew best. The words sat heavy between us. It wasn't just that they'd plotted behind my back, it was that they'd built an entire narrative where my compliance was a foregone conclusion. That's enlightening, I said finally, and depressing. There's more, Noah said, lowering his voice. You probably don't know this, but your parents refinanced their house about 6 months ago. Took out a big chunk of equity. They have money, Evelyn. They could have helped us with a down payment themselves if they wanted to. They just didn't want to spend their own. The statement hit like a cold splash of water. I thought back to all the times they'd claimed they didn't have that kind of money when it came to helping Sienna, or anyone really. All those conversations had been lies built on convenience. How do you know that? I asked. I overheard them talking about it once, and then I saw some paperwork lying out on the kitchen counter when we were over for dinner. I wasn't snooping, it was just there, big bank logo, refinance agreement, the whole thing. I exhaled slowly. So this wasn't about necessity. It was about using what I had so they wouldn't have to touch what was theirs. Noah nodded. Exactly. I don't expect this to fix anything between you and Sienna, but I didn't want you walking around thinking you were the villain here. You weren't. It was strange hearing validation from someone who was technically part of the other side. But I appreciated it more than I could say. Thanks for telling me, I said. I'm sure this won't make things easier for you with her. He gave a small, rueful smile. Probably not, but some things are worth saying anyway. As we parted ways, I felt the sting of betrayal sharpen into something else, not just anger, but clarity. My grandmother's warning had been dead on, but even she might not have guessed just how calculated it would be. Now I knew, and I intended to act accordingly. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, scribbling numbers in the margins of my grandmother's old recipe book. It felt fitting to plan something important with her presence close at hand. Noah's honesty had stuck with me all day. He hadn't tried to make excuses for Sienna or my parents. He'd just laid out the truth. And the truth was, whatever my feelings toward them, there was someone else in the middle of all this who hadn't done anything wrong. My unborn niece, Lily. The thought of her growing up in the middle of this tangled mess made my chest tighten. I couldn't undo what had been said or done, but I could make sure she had something in her corner, something safe from manipulation, guilt, or family consensus. I called my attorney the next morning. I want to set up an educational trust, I told her, for my sister's child. College expenses only, no early withdrawals for anything else. Ironclad. She didn't ask why. She just started taking notes, and by the end of the week, the trust was drafted, funded with a portion of the proceeds from the farmhouse sale. It wasn't the majority of the money, but it was enough to cover 4 years at a good university when the time came, with room for inflation. When the paperwork was finalised, I put together a small package for Noah: the trust documents, a letter explaining how it worked, and a gift. I'd found the gift in a small artisan shop downtown, a hand-stitched quilt in soft blues and creams, eerily similar to the one my grandmother had made for me. I imagined Lily wrapped in it, maybe years from now, hearing stories about the great-grandmother she'd never meet. I wrote a short note to go with it. "Noah, this is for Lily. The trust will make sure her education is never in question. The quilt is just something I hope she'll love as much as I loved mine. Evelyn." I dropped the package at the post office and didn't think about it again until 2 days later when my phone buzzed with a text from Noah. "Got the package. Thank you doesn't cover it. Sienna will never admit this, but you just saved us from a massive mistake." She had her heart set on a house way beyond what we could afford. "Your parents were pushing us to go for it, saying they'd help with the down payment if you chipped in. Without that, we'd have been drowning in debt for years." I read the message twice, my stomach knotting. So it had gone even further than I realised, not just taking my house, but using it as leverage to push Sienna into a financial decision that could have ruined them. "You did the right thing," Noah's message continued, "even if no one else in that house says it out loud." I set the phone down and let the relief wash over me. This was the kind of validation I'd stopped expecting from my family, but hearing it from someone inside their circle meant more than I could have guessed. The farmhouse was gone. My relationship with my parents and sister was fractured. But Lily would have something untouchable, something that couldn't be reallocated or agreed upon at a Sunday dinner I wasn't invited to, and for now, that was enough. It was a rainy Thursday evening when my phone lit up with a number I hadn't seen in weeks: Mom. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something in my gut told me to answer. "Evelyn?" Her voice was softer than I remembered, thinner somehow. "I wanted to call and thank you for what you did for Lily." I leaned against the counter, unsure what to say. "She's my niece. I want her to have a good future." There was a pause on the other end. "We'd like you to come for dinner. Sunday. Sienna will be there with the baby. It's time you met her." I could hear the unspoken plea in her voice, but I wasn't going to walk back into that house without ground rules. "If I come," I said carefully, "we don't talk about the farmhouse. Not a word." Another pause, then, "All right, we won't bring it up." When I pulled into my parents' driveway that Sunday, the sky was heavy with clouds, the air damp with the smell of wet leaves. I carried a small bouquet of fresh flowers, neutral territory, and a jar of homemade applesauce I'd made from a market hall, a quiet nod to the orchard. Mom greeted me at the door with a tentative smile. "You look good," she said, stepping aside. Dad was in the living room adjusting his tie like he was preparing for a job interview rather than a family dinner. "Evelyn," he said with a stiff nod, "glad you could make it." Sienna was in the corner, rocking a tiny bundle in her arms. She didn't stand when I approached, but she looked down at the baby and said, "Lily, this is your Aunt Evelyn." I bent slightly, taking in the small, perfect face, dark hair, impossibly tiny fingers curled into a fist. "Hello, Lily," I murmured. "It's nice to finally meet you." We moved to the dining table, the seating arrangement subtly adjusted, so I wasn't directly across from either parent. Conversation stayed on safe topics at first: work, the weather, a new restaurant in town. Mum passed me the roasted vegetables. Dad carved the chicken. Sienna kept her focus on Lily, occasionally chiming in about baby milestones. Halfway through the meal, just as I was starting to believe we might get through the evening without a crack in the truce, Dad cleared his throat. He didn't look at me right away, instead slicing another piece of chicken. "Lily will know," he said finally, "that her aunt gave her a future." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Small at first, but rippling outward. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't even a direct acknowledgement of the trust, but it was something I had never heard from him before. A public admission that I had done something worth honouring. Mum glanced at him, then at me, as if gauging my reaction. Sienna didn't say anything, but her fork slowed against her plate. "Thank you," I said simply, letting the moment stand without layering it with more than it could hold. The conversation shifted again, this time to safer ground, holiday plans, the neighbour's new puppy. But that single sentence hung in the back of my mind for the rest of the evening. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't enough to undo what had been done, but it was a start. After dessert, Mum busied herself in the kitchen and Dad retreated to the living room with the pretext of checking the news. Sienna lingered at the table, bouncing Lily gently against her shoulder. The baby's eyelids fluttered in that half-sleep that comes right before they go completely under. "Do you want to hold her for a bit?" Sienna asked, almost casually. "Sure," I said, standing. I took Lily carefully, cradling her against me. She was lighter than I expected and warm, her tiny breaths soft against my neck. We drifted toward the porch, where the evening air was cool but not cold, the kind that carried the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke. We sat in the rocking chairs, side by side, the creak of the wood beneath us filling the spaces between our words. For a while, we just watched the quiet street, neighbours' porch lights winking on one by one. Finally, Sienna broke the silence. "I owe you an apology." I turned my head slightly, surprised. She was looking straight ahead, her hands clasped in her lap now that Lily was in mine. "For what, exactly?" I asked. "For assuming the house was mine for the taking," she said, her voice low. "I didn't even think about what it meant to you. I just saw it as a solution to my problem. And I let Mum and Dad convince me it was the logical choice because you didn't need it as much as I did." I kept my tone even. It wasn't just about need, it was about ownership, about respect. "I know that now," she said quickly. "Back then, I guess I thought you've always been the one who could handle losing something. You've always landed on your feet. I didn't think about how wrong that was." We rocked in silence for a moment longer. The porch light buzzed faintly above us. "You know," Sienna continued, "when I first had Lily, everything was about survival, feeding her, changing her, making sure she was safe. But as the weeks went by, I started thinking about the future, her future, what kind of world I want her to grow up in. And one night, while I was holding her, it just hit me. No one should have the right to make choices about her life without her say-so. Not me, not Mom and Dad, not anyone." I glanced at her, hearing something in her voice I hadn't before. Conviction. "That's when I realised what I'd done to you," she said. "I tried to take away something that was yours, something you loved, without asking if that was okay. I hate to admit it, but I became exactly the kind of person I don't want Lily to be surrounded by." Her words were unvarnished, without the defensive edge I'd come to expect. I appreciate you saying that, I told her. It's more than I've heard from anyone else in this family. She gave a small, humourless laugh. Don't give me too much credit. I still wish things had gone differently, but I get why you did what you did now. And I'm glad you didn't just roll over and let it happen. Lily stirred in my arms, letting out a small sigh before settling again. I thought about how easy it would be to pass along the family pattern of entitlement and unspoken debts, and how much harder it was to break it. You've got a chance to teach her something different, I said quietly. That's worth more than any house. Sienna nodded slowly. Yeah, I see that now. We sat there until the porch light began to attract moths, until Mum called us back inside, but the conversation stayed with me long after I'd driven home. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet. But it was the first honest bridge between us in years, one built not on guilt or obligation, but on understanding. The weeks after that, porch conversation felt different. Not perfect. There were still unspoken tensions and the occasional awkward pause. But the air wasn't quite as charged. We began meeting for dinners again, alternating between my condo and Sienna and Noah's place. It was easier that way. Neutral territory each time, with the farmhouse absent from the backdrop. At my condo, I'd cook simple meals, roast chicken, pasta with fresh basil from the pots on my balcony. And Sienna would bring dessert, usually something from the bakery near her building. When we met at her place, Noah would man the grill on their tiny patio, and my parents would fuss over Lily in the living room. It wasn't lost on me that these dinners were nothing like the old Sunday gatherings at my parents' house. There was no sense of obligation, no underlying agenda. If someone couldn't make it, there were no guilt trips, just a quick reschedule. It was almost healthy. A few months in, my parents made an announcement over dinner at Sienna's. They'd helped her and Noah buy a condo, not a sprawling farmhouse, not something wildly beyond their means, but a bright 2-bedroom in a quiet neighbourhood with a small balcony for potted plants and a nursery that caught the morning sun. We wanted them to have a stable place to raise Lily, my mother said, glancing at me as if to gauge my reaction. That's great, I replied honestly. It sounds perfect for you. I didn't add the obvious, that they could have done this from the beginning, without tearing our family apart in the process. It was enough that they'd finally done it the right way. Late that summer, I got an email from Marcus. It was a single line. The orchard is looking good this year. You should come see it. I hesitated for a day before replying, but curiosity and a tug of something I couldn't quite name won out. When I pulled up the familiar gravel driveway, my heart gave a small, involuntary lurch. The house looked the same, but the flower beds were fuller, the paint on the porch rails freshly touched up. Marcus greeted me with his usual calm smile. Good to see you, Evelyn. Inside, the kitchen still smelled faintly of lemon oil, and the studio's north-facing windows poured light over the work table, just as they always had. But it was the orchard that drew me outside. The trees were heavy with fruit, their branches dipping under the weight. Looks like a good harvest, I said, brushing my fingers over the smooth skin of an apple. That's why I wanted you to come, Marcus replied. I could use an extra set of hands this fall. And I figured maybe you'd like to be part of it again. I looked at him, surprised. You mean help with the harvest? He nodded. It's still your grandmother's orchard in spirit. I'd like to keep that spirit alive. It was an invitation I hadn't expected, a way back into the farmhouse's story without undoing the boundary I'd set. I felt something loosen in my chest. "I'd like that," I said finally. We walked the rows together, talking about pruning schedules and cider recipes, the late blooms and the early frosts. For the first time in a long while, I felt the kind of peace I'd only ever associated with this place. Except now it came without the weight of possession. By Lily's second birthday, the fractures in our family had begun to mend, not erased, but bridged in small, deliberate ways. She was the anchor now, the reason we all showed up, even when the past still hummed quietly in the background. Sienna and I found ourselves talking more, often about parenting philosophies or how to keep Lily curious and kind. Sometimes when Noah had late meetings, I'd pick Lily up from daycare and take her to the park. Sienna never seemed threatened by it. In fact, she encouraged it. "She adores you," she'd say, watching us from a bench as Lily climbed the jungle gym with fearless energy. In those moments, I realised we were, in our own way, co-raising her, not in the logistical sense, but in the values we wanted her to grow up with. Respect for others, the courage to say no when something didn't feel right. The understanding that family was about choice as much as blood. One crisp autumn afternoon, after a day helping Marcus in the orchard, I sat on my balcony, a mug of cider warming my hands. I thought about the path that had led me here, the shouting matches, the slammed doors, the letters from lawyers. I thought about the cold shock of being treated like an obstacle rather than a daughter, and the harder truth of accepting that I couldn't change my family's view of me overnight. Being cast out, I murmured to no one, taught me to keep myself in. It was a strange lesson, but a true one. If being part of the family meant erasing myself, then stepping back had been the only way to stay whole. A week later, an envelope arrived in the mail. The handwriting was unfamiliar, looping but steady. Inside was a short letter from a woman named Margaret Ellis, who introduced herself as a childhood friend of my grandmother's. "Evelyn, Nora spoke of you often. She worried about the weight you carried for others, and she hoped the house would be both a refuge and a teacher. I heard about what happened, and I want you to know she would have been proud. You didn't just keep the house safe while it was yours. You honoured her wish to let it go on your own terms. That's harder than most people realise." I read it twice, the words sinking in like warm sunlight after a long winter. It was one thing to believe I'd done right. It was another to have someone who knew my grandmother confirm it. The letter sat on my desk for days, not because I didn't know what to do with it, but because it felt like the closing of a chapter. When I think about the choice I made, the choice to sell, to stand firm, to risk the relationships that had defined my life, it no longer feels like an act of rebellion. It feels like an act of preservation. If there's one thing I'd tell anyone facing the same impossible equation, it's this. When the choice is between maintaining a false peace or keeping your self-respect, choose the one that lets you look in the mirror without flinching. Because the hardest part of being abandoned by the people you love isn't losing them. It's realizing you might have abandoned yourself first just to keep them close, and nothing is worth that.